Millionaire widower takes his blind daughter to the zoo until a black nanny changes her life. "Daddy, why is that lady yelling at the girl?" whispered Emma, her little hand squeezing Thomas's tighter as they walked through the penguin area of the Chicago Zoo. The scene unfolding a few feet away was enough to make any decent person feel embarrassed for her. A middle-aged woman laden with expensive jewelry and with that air of superiority that only old money can buy, was yelling at a young African-American woman who was gently holding the hand of a little blonde girl. "I don't pay a fortune for my granddaughter to frequent the same spaces as people like you," said the woman, her sharp voice echoing throughout the area. "You have your own places to go, don't you think?" Thomas Harrison, CEO of one of the largest technology companies in the country, felt that familiar twinge in his stomach. At 35, widowed for 2 years, he had learned that the world could be cruel in unimaginable ways. But seeing this happen in front of his 8-year-old daughter, who had lost her sight in a car accident along with her mother, was more than he could bear in silence. The young nanny maintained her composure with impressive dignity. "Ma'am, I'm just taking care of Lily as I always do. We're not bothering anyone." "Bothering?" The woman laughed dismissively. "Your mere presence here is a nuisance. People like you don't know their place in society." Emma tugged at her father's sleeve. "Daddy, you're being mean to the pretty lady." "I can sense that she's sad." Since losing her sight, Emma had developed a keen sensitivity to picking up on emotions in people's voices, and even without being able to see, she could perfectly sense the injustice unfolding. Thomas watched the young nanny for a moment. There was something about her that intrigued him. Despite all that public humiliation, she maintained a serene posture, almost as if she had expected it. Her eyes showed no surprise, but rather a quiet determination that made Thomas wonder if there was more to the story than met the eye. The woman continued her prejudiced tirade when the little blonde girl broke free from the nanny's hand and ran toward the penguins. "Lily, no!" shouted the young woman, running after the child who was heading dangerously close to the animal's enclosure. With an agile and precise movement, she reached the girl just as she stumbled, saving her from a fall that could have been fatal. But in doing so, she slipped herself, falling on the wet ground and completely dirtying her uniform. The crowd that had gathered watched in silence. The wealthy woman, seeing her granddaughter safe in the nanny's arms, showed not a shred of gratitude. "Now look what you've done," she shouted. "You can't even take care of a child properly without causing a scandal. People like you should never be responsible for our children." At that moment, Thomas noticed something that made him freeze. The nanny looked directly at her and smiled. Not a smile of submission or embarrassment, but something different. There was confidence there, as if she knew something everyone else was unaware of. "You're right," said the young woman, slowly wiping the mud off her uniform. "People like me really do have a specific place in society." Thomas felt that he had just witnessed the beginning of something much bigger than a simple argument. At the zoo, there were secrets in that exchange of glances, and his business intuition, honed by years of closing million-dollar deals, told him that this nanny was not at all what she appeared to be. If this story of injustice and second chances touched him as much as it touched me, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happened next proved that people are not always what they seem, and sometimes true revenge comes from where we least expect it. In the days following that encounter at the zoo, Thomas couldn't get the scene out of his head. There was something about the way that young nanny reacted that bothered him in a strange way, like when you feel like you've forgotten something important but can't remember what it is. Emma noticed her father's distraction during dinner that night. "Daddy, you're thinking about the lady at the zoo, aren't you?" she asked, her little hands playing with her fork. How did you know? Thomas smiled, impressed once, again by his daughter's keen perception. Because you're quiet in a different way when you're worried about other people. It's different from when you're quiet thinking about work. Thomas chuckled softly. Since the accident that took Emma's sight, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to read people's emotions through small signs that others would never notice. It was as if the loss of her sight had sharpened all her other senses. She wasn't like the other nannies I've seen, Emma continued. There was something special about her voice, as if she were, I don't know, as if she were much smarter than she let on. This time, however, Thomas managed to overhear part of the conversation. Jasmine, I've told you not to give Lily extravagant ideas, said the older woman, whom Thomas now knew to be Mrs. Victoria Ashworth, one of Chicago's most traditional families. People like you need to understand that there are limits to what you can teach our children. The young nanny, apparently named Jasmine, maintained that same serene posture. Of course, Mrs. Ashworth, I just helped Lily with her math homework as you requested. I don't want you putting ideas about college in her head. Lily will attend the same institutions our family has always attended. She doesn't need inappropriate inspiration. Thomas felt his blood boil. That woman was basically saying that the nanny should aspire to nothing more than her position as a servant. Jasmine smiled in that same intriguing way Thomas had noticed before. You're right, ma'am. Everyone should know his place in society. But there was something in the way she said it that made Thomas pay closer attention. It didn't sound like submission. It sounded like someone who knew exactly where she belonged, and that perhaps that place was very different from what Mrs. Ashworth imagined. That night, Thomas did something he didn't usually do. He researched the Ashworth family on the internet. What he found made him understand that woman's arrogance better. The Ashworths owned one of the largest private school chains in the country, in addition to having investments in several other sectors. Victoria Ashworth in particular was known for her family traditions and for maintaining an extremely closed social circle. But it was the next day that things got really interesting. Thomas was in a meeting with investors when his assistant knocked on the door looking nervous. Mr. Harrison, there's a young woman here who says she has a business proposal. I wouldn't normally interrupt, but she specifically mentioned the inclusive education project you've been developing. Thomas frowned. The inclusive education project was personal to him, inspired by Emma's experience. He was developing technologies to make education more accessible to children with disabilities, but he hadn't yet made it public. Send her in. When the door opened, Thomas nearly fell out of his chair. It was Jasmine the zookeeper, but now she wasn't in uniform. She wore an elegant blazer, carried a leather briefcase, and had a completely different posture. Mr. Harrison, she said, extending her hand with a professional smile. My name is Jasmine Carter, and I believe we have a lot to talk about. The investors in the room looked confused, but Thomas gestured for her to continue. I have a PhD in special education from Harvard University, Jasmine began, taking some papers out of her briefcase. And I've been following your work for some time, especially after I found out you're the father of a visually impaired child. Thomas felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath his feet. How do you know about Emma? Because I make a point of getting to know the people I intend to do business with, Jasmine replied with a smile, and because, coincidentally, I work for a family that frequents the same places you do. That's when Thomas understood. You're really the Ashworth's nanny. Temporarily, said Jasmine, her eyes sparkling with amusement. You see, Mr. Harrison, sometimes we need to put ourselves in specific positions to really understand how the world works, And what I discovered working for the Ashworths was enlightening. She opened the folder and showed him documents that made Thomas gulp. They were contracts, emails, and recordings, evidence of how the Ashworth family had been discriminating against employees, students, and entire families at their schools. Mrs. Victoria Ashworth has no idea who really works for her, Jasmine continued. She hired me through an agency without doing a proper background check. All she saw was a young black woman in need of work, and she assumed I was limited. Thomas was speechless. You deliberately infiltrated their home. I prefer to say that I accepted a very valuable field research opportunity. Jasmine smiled. And now, Mr. Harrison, I have a proposal that could benefit both of our goals. Thomas looked at the investors, who seemed fascinated by the unfolding situation. He was beginning to realize that he had completely underestimated her, just as Victoria Ashworth had done. What kind of proposal? He asked, his mind already racing with possibilities. Jasmine leaned forward, her eyes taking on an intensity that made Thomas realize he was facing someone far more dangerous and powerful than anyone in that room could imagine. The kind of proposal that will make Victoria Ashworth realize she underestimated the wrong person, she said, her voice low but laden with determination that sent a shiver down Thomas's spine. And that will ensure that no child like Emma is ever deprived of the opportunities she deserves because of prejudice disguised as tradition. At that moment, Thomas knew he was witnessing the beginning of something much bigger than simple personal revenge. Jasmine Carter had turned months of humiliation into a war strategy, and the battle ahead would change not only the Ashworths' lives, but the entire educational system she represented. 2 weeks after that fateful meeting, Thomas was in his office when he received an unexpected call. Mr. Harrison, this is Detective Rodriguez from the Chicago Civil Rights Department. We have received an anonymous tip about discriminatory practices at Ashworth schools. Would you like to talk to us? Thomas looked at Jasmine, who was sitting across the table with a discreet smile. She had kept her word. The authorities were already investigating. Of course, Detective. When would be convenient? Meanwhile, Victoria Ashworth was in her luxurious office, completely oblivious to the storm brewing. She had just fired 3 more employees, all black, on allegations of cultural inadequacy for her institutions. Jasmine seems to be behaving better lately, she commented to her personal assistant. Maybe she's finally learned her place. What Victoria didn't know was that Jasmine had discreetly installed small recorders in strategic locations around the house. Every prejudiced comment, every humiliating order, every discriminatory phone conversation was being meticulously documented. Thomas decided to test the waters. He called Victoria directly, introducing himself as a CEO interested in enrolling Emma in one of the Ashworth schools, a visually impaired child. Victoria's voice was visibly uncomfortable on the other end of the line. Mr. Harrison, our institutions maintain very specific standards. We don't have the appropriate structure for that kind of special situation. I see, Thomas said calmly. And what kind of situation do you consider appropriate? Well, our students come from traditional families with values similar to ours. Children who fit naturally into our academic environment of excellence. Thomas recorded every word. Victoria had just confessed to discrimination against children with disabilities on a recorded call. That evening, Thomas received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Marcus Williams, a civil rights attorney and Jasmine's former Harvard classmate, had flown in from New York specifically to review the case. Thomas, what you've gathered here is pure dynamite, Marcus said, leafing through the evidence. We're not just talking about a few inappropriate statements. This is a systematic pattern of discrimination that goes back decades. Dr. Williams had represented similar cases against other elite institutions and knew exactly how to proceed. With this documentation, we can not only expose the discrimination, but also force permanent structural changes. Emma, who was playing with her toys in the corner of the room, looked up. "Daddy, why do you talk so much about the mean lady at the zoo?" Thomas crouched down next to his daughter. "We're trying to get her to stop being mean to other people, sweetheart." "And will you succeed?" Thomas looked at Jasmine and Marcus. "Yes, Emma. We will succeed." The following week, Victoria made the mistake that would seal her fate. During a meeting with school parents, she made even more explicit comments about maintaining appropriate racial standards and avoiding the inappropriate mixing of social classes. What she didn't know was that 3 parents at the meeting were actually undercover investigators working in coordination with Thomas and his team. "You know, Thomas," Jasmine said one night as they organized the latest evidence, "there's something almost poetic about all this. Victoria always said that people like her need to know their place in society." "And what is her place?" Thomas asked, curious. Jasmine smiled in that enigmatic way he knew so well. "At the top of the Harvard graduation list, in the front row of social change, and now at the center of an investigation that will rewrite how institutions like hers operate." Thomas realized at that moment that Victoria Ashworth had underestimated not only Jasmine, but an entire network of highly qualified people who were tired of accepting discrimination disguised as tradition. At the end of that week, Thomas received a phone call that made him smile for the first time in months. "Mr. Harrison, this is Detective Rodriguez again. We have enough material to move forward with formal charges. The operation will take place on Monday." Thomas looked out the office window, where Emma played in the garden with the confidence of a child who knew she was protected. In a few days, Victoria Ashworth would discover that she had chosen the wrong people to humiliate. Jasmine appeared at the office door with a folder in her hand, and that smile that Thomas now recognized as the harbinger of something extraordinary. "Ready for the final phase?" she asked. Thomas nodded, feeling a mixture of anxiety and satisfaction. After weeks of careful preparation, he was about to show Victoria Ashworth that underestimating the right people could cost her far more than she ever imagined paying. For a moment, when everything seemed perfectly aligned for justice to triumph, Thomas couldn't imagine that Victoria had one last ace up her sleeve, something that would test not only his plan, but also his determination to protect Emma from a world that still resisted accepting that true excellence knows no color, origin, or physical limitations. On Monday morning, Victoria Ashworth woke up as she always did, confident, powerful, and completely oblivious to the fact that her life was about to publicly unravel. She ate her breakfast in the garden of her Lake Forest mansion, leafing through the local newspapers as she mentally planned the school board meeting that would take place that afternoon. There were rumors that some troublesome parents wanted to question the admission policies, but Victoria wasn't worried. After all, she had controlled that board for 15 years. "Jasmine," she called toward the kitchen, "get Lily's school uniform ready and make sure that she doesn't interact with those unsuitable children during recess." Jasmine appeared at the door as she always did, with that submissive posture that Victoria had learned to appreciate. "Of course, Mrs. Ashworth. By the way, you received a call from the Chicago Tribune. They said they wanted an interview about your contributions to traditional education." Victoria smiled with satisfaction. Finally, the recognition she deserved. "Excellent. Schedule it for this afternoon after the board meeting." What Victoria didn't know was that at that very moment, in 3 different locations across the city, a coordinated operation was being executed with military precision. Thomas was in his conference room with Dr. Marcus Williams, Detective Rodriguez, and 6 other civil rights attorneys. On the table were stacks of evidence organized into folders marked with specific dates and times. Timing is crucial, Marcus explained. The federal investigation will be announced at 2 p.m. during the board meeting. By 2:15, reporters will have received all the recordings. At 2:30, the prosecutor will be presenting the formal charges. Detective Rodriguez confirmed via radio, "Teams in position. Search and seizure warrants ready for execution." That same morning, Victoria arrived at Ashworth School's headquarters with her usual confidence. The glass and marble building, built with decades of profits obtained through discriminatory practices, had never looked more imposing. At 2 hours sharp, Victoria was in her presidential chair on the board, surrounded by 5 other members, all white, all wealthy, all carefully selected to never question her decisions. "The first item on the agenda," Victoria began, "is the review of admission policies that some parents, less informed parents, have recently questioned." It was at that moment that Detective Rodriguez entered the room, accompanied by 2 federal agents and a bailiff. "Mrs. Ashworth," the detective's voice cut through the air like a knife, "you are under formal investigation for civil rights violations, systematic discrimination, and educational fraud under federal jurisdiction." The silence in the room was deafening. Victoria felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath her feet, but she tried to maintain her composure. "This is absurd," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about." The detective placed a small tape recorder on the table. "Do you recognize your own voice, ma'am?" The recording began to play, crystal clear and unmistakable. "I don't pay a fortune for my granddaughter to attend the same spaces as people like you. You have your own places to go." The board members looked at each other with growing panic. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. "That was taken out of context," she protested, but her voice sounded desperate. The detective played another recording, this time of the phone conversation with Thomas. "Our students come from traditional families with values similar to ours. Children who fit naturally into our environment of excellence." And then another. "I don't want you putting ideas about college in her head. Lily will attend the same institutions our family has always attended. She doesn't need inappropriate inspirations." Each recording was like a brick being removed from the foundations of her life. Victoria realized with growing horror that there were dozens of them. "How did you get these?" she whispered, but deep down she already knew the answer. At that moment, the door opened again. Jasmine entered, but not as the submissive nanny Victoria knew. She wore an elegant blazer and carried a leather briefcase, accompanied by Thomas and Dr. Marcus Williams. "Allow me to properly reintroduce myself," she said with a smile that sent chills down Victoria's spine. "Dr. Jasmine Carter, Ph.D., in special education from Harvard University, expert in institutional discrimination, and for the past 6 months, your undercover employee." Victoria stared at Jasmine as if she were seeing a ghost. You completely deceived me." "No," Jasmine replied calmly. "You deceived yourself. You saw a young black woman in need of work and assumed I was intellectually limited. Your own preconceptions blinded you to who I really was." Dr. Williams opened his briefcase and began distributing documents. "These are copies of the evidence that will be presented to the federal grand jury. 6 months of recordings documenting systematic discrimination, internal emails proving deliberate racist policies, and testimonies from dozens of families who have been harmed." Victoria looked around the room seeking support, but the other board members were too busy trying to physically distance themselves from her. "You can't do this to me," she said, her voice now clearly desperate. My family built these institutions. We have traditions, standards. Traditions of discrimination, Thomas interrupted, speaking for the first time. Standards of prejudice. And now, consequences. The detective handed over the search and seizure warrants. All computers, files, and financial documents from Ashworth schools were being confiscated for forensic analysis. The school's operations were suspended pending federal investigation. Victoria tried to stand, but her legs failed her. 15 years of absolute power. A lifetime of unquestioned privilege, all crumbling in a matter of minutes. My reputation, she murmured, more to herself than to the others. My family, our lineage. Your reputation is now that of a civil criminal, Dr. Williams said emotionlessly, and your lineage will be remembered as an example of how systematic prejudice ultimately finds justice. At that moment, Victoria's cell phone began to ring incessantly. Journalists, members of high society, business partners, all wanting answers about the headlines that were already beginning to circulate. Jasmine approached the table where Victoria still sat, paralyzed. Remember when you told me that people like me need to know our place in society? Victoria nodded weakly. Well, now you've found out what my place really is, Jasmine continued with dignity. And what yours is. Thomas watched the scene with a mixture of satisfaction and pity. The woman who had publicly humiliated a brilliant young woman, who had denied opportunities to innocent children, who had built an empire based on prejudice disguised as tradition, now faced the reality that her actions had consequences. But, as Victoria Ashworth discovered that her downfall was only the beginning of an investigation that would reveal decades of injustice, one question hung in the air. Could justice, however satisfying, really repair the damage done to so many families? Over the years? 6 months after Victoria Ashworth's spectacular fall, Thomas was in his new office looking at the headlines that still echoed across the country. Former elite school principal sentenced to 5 years in prison for systematic discrimination, read the Chicago Tribune. Victoria didn't just lose her freedom. She lost her assets, which were confiscated to pay compensation to the families she had harmed. She lost her social circle. No one in high society wanted to be seen near a convicted civil criminal. And she lost what she valued most, her impeccable reputation, which became a national example of how prejudice disguised as tradition finally meets justice. Daddy, did you see? 3 more families enrolled in our school today, Emma said, entering the office with that radiant confidence that only truly happy children possess. Children with and without disabilities learned side by side, breaking down barriers that institutions like Ashworth schools had spent decades building. Emma, now 9, had become the school's unofficial ambassador. Her ability to see beyond appearances inspired other children with disabilities to never underestimate their own potential. Dr. Carter is in the conference room with the investors. From San Francisco, Emma continued. They want to open 5 more schools next year. Jasmine had become one of the most respected educators in the country. Her book on undercover work to combat institutional discrimination was being used in university courses, and her TED Talks had racked up millions of views. That afternoon, Thomas received an unexpected call. It was Detective Rodriguez with an IB update on Victoria. She lost her final appeal today, he reported. She'll serve her full sentence, and there's more. Dozens of other families are coming forward with similar cases against the Ashworth network. It seems you've unearthed, Dewey, decades of injustice. Thomas hung up thoughtfully. The revenge they had sought had turned into something much bigger. A national movement for educational reform that would benefit thousands of children for generations to come. Emma found him in the garden later, sitting on the same bench where they used to have lunch before everything changed. "Dad, do you still think about that mean lady at the zoo?" she asked, settling down by his side. "Sometimes," Thomas admitted, "but not with anger. With gratitude." "Gratitude?" Emma tilted her head. "She showed us that the world needed to change, and thanks to her, we were able to make that change happen." Emma smiled in that wise way that always surprised Thomas. Dr. Carter always says that the best revenge is to build something better than what they tried to destroy. Thomas hugged his daughter, looking through the school window at other children playing together. Children of all colors, some with disabilities, some without, all learning that true excellence knows no artificial barriers. Victoria Ashworth had tried to use her power to perpetuate discrimination. Jasmine Carter used her intelligence to dismantle an entire system of prejudice. And in the end, the woman who believed that people like Jasmine should know their place discovered that Jasmine's place was at the forefront of an educational revolution that would rewrite the future for thousands of children. The best revenge isn't destroying those who hurt you. It's building something so extraordinary that it renders everything they tried to do against you irrelevant. If this story of intelligent justice has inspired you as much as it has inspired me, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that sometimes karma needs a little help from human intelligence.